The Kennedy administration had many conspiracies and a multitude of confusing twists and turns. Kennedy was the 35th president from 1961 to 1963 when he was assassinated in Dallas. He had fought in war in World War II and returned to become a member of the Senate and eventually also became nominated by the Democratic Party for president. He was also the first and only Roman Catholic president to date. In his campaign, he spoke very famous words, which were, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." He wanted the United States to become sensational again, to get everything to work for the good of the country and its people as a whole. Kennedy also pushed greatly for the civil rights movement. Kennedy was faced with many issues from Russia to the Cold War, still shrouded in mystery, and of course the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the world was literally seconds away from war with nuclear weapons of mass destruction. Kennedy overall wanted peace and harmony in the world and prosperity in the United States with equal rights and to go as far as he could. When people talk of the new frontier, it's not always earthly. The new frontier can usually mean space, essentially untouched, and then the Soviets at that time launched a satellite called Sputnik, which orbited the Earth and prompted the so-called space race as the United States initiated the formation of NASA. The Soviets then put men in orbit in space, and Kennedy sent some of our men to orbit. Ultimately, the United States sent Neil Armstrong to the moon in one of the most controversial tales of the 20th century, and still greatly debated now. And then, of course, you have Cuba, which came to the picture. For the Cubans were allied of the United States until Castro came along and went to allegiance with the Soviets, and Kennedy and the CIA initiated the Bay of Pigs, where 15,000 Cubans over here who were against Castro went to go invade Cuba, but the Cubans were decimated and essentially killed or captured, all of them.
The Bay of Pigs invasion was a failed military invasion of Cuba undertaken by the CIA-sponsored paramilitary group Brigade 2506 on the 17th of April, 1961. Brigade 2506 was created to attack and overthrow the communist government ruled under Fidel Castro. The attack was launched from Guatemala, and Brigade 2506 was defeated within 3 days of the Cuban armed forces. The idea of the invasion was created by Dwight D. Eisenhower of March 1960. He was afraid of the power that they were gaining after they had allied with the Soviet Union. Since John F. Kennedy was elected later in 1960, he became in charge of the invasion plan. The original plan was that a 1,400-man attack force would come along the shore of the Bay of Pigs at night and surprise attack whenever they had least expected it. Sadly, this did not work out the way that they had planned. Immediately after arrival, Brigade 2506 had come under heavy fire and Cuban aircrafts had sunk their escort ships. Castro had quickly gathered 20,000 troops by the next day to round up the survivors of Brigade 2506. 1,200 men were imprisoned and 100 men were killed.
What is known as the Cuban Missile Crisis actually began on October 15, 1962, the day that the U.S. intelligence personnel analyzing U-2 spy plane data discovered that the Soviets were building medium-range missile sites in Cuba. The next day, President Kennedy secretly convened an emergency meeting of his senior military, political, and diplomatic advisors to discuss the ammunition development. The group became known as EXCOM, short for Executive Committee. After rejecting a surgical airstrike against the missile sites, EXCOM decided on a naval quarantine and a demand that the bases be dismantled and the missiles removed. On the night of October 22nd, Kennedy went on national television to announce his decision. During the next 6 days, the crisis escalated to a breaking point as the world tottered on the brink of nuclear war between the two superpowers. On October 25th, the aircraft carrier USS Essex and the destroyer USS Gearing attempted to intercept the Soviet tanker Bucharest as it crossed over the U.S. quarantine of Cuba. The Soviet ship failed to cooperate, but the U.S. Navy restrained itself from forcibly seizing the ship, deeming it unlikely that the tanker was carrying offensive weapons. On October 26, Kennedy learned that the work on the missile bases was proceeding without interruption, and ExComm considered authorizing a U.S. invasion of Cuba. The same day, the Soviets transmitted a proposal for ending the crisis. The missile bases would be removed in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba. The next day, a U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba, and its pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson, was killed. To the dismay of the Pentagon, Kennedy forbid a military retaliation unless any more surveillance planes were fired upon over Cuba. To defuse the worsening crisis, Kennedy and his advisors agreed to dismantle the U.S. missile sites in Turkey, but at a later date, in order to prevent the protests of Turkey, a key NATO member. On October 28th, with the airing of the public message on Moscow radio, the USSR confirmed its willingness to proceed with the solution secretly proposed by the Americans the day before. In the afternoon, Soviet technicians began dismantling the missile sites, and the world stepped back from the brink of nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis was effectively over. In November, Kennedy called off the blockade, and by the end of the year, all the offensive missiles had left Cuba. Soon after, the United States quietly removed its missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis seemed at the time a clear victory for the United States, but Cuba emerged from the episode with a much greater sense of security. A succession of U.S. administrations have honored Kennedy's pledge not to invade Cuba, and the communist island nation situated just 80 miles from Florida remains a thorn in the side of the U.S. foreign policy. The removal of antiquated Jupiter missiles from Turkey had no detrimental effect on U.S. nuclear strategy, but the Cuban Missile Crisis convinced a humiliated USSR to commence a massive nuclear buildup. In the 1970s, the Soviet Union reached nuclear parity with the United States and built intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of striking any city in the United States.